I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I was always the skeptic, the one who looked for logical explanations when my friends would share their paranormal experiences. That changed last winter when I spent a week alone in my new house. I had just moved into a modest 2-story home in a quiet suburb outside of Portland. The previous owners had lived there for nearly 40 years before deciding to downsize after their children moved out. It was a charming place with wooden floors, large windows, and a spacious backyard, perfect for someone like me who worked from home and needed the extra space for a home office. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and setting up my workspace in the spare bedroom downstairs. The house creaked and settled at night, but that's normal for older homes, especially during winter when the temperature drops. I didn't think much of it. It was on the 4th night that I first heard the knocking. I was in the living room watching a movie when 3 distinct knocks came from upstairs. They were deliberate, not the random creaks of a house settling or pipes expanding. A perfect rhythm with equal spacing between each sound. I paused my movie and listened. Nothing. After a minute of silence, I convinced myself it was just the house settling in a way I wasn't familiar with yet. I resumed my movie, but found myself straining to hear any other sounds over the dialogue. 20 minutes later, it happened again. 3 knocks in the same deliberate pattern. This time, I muted the TV immediately and listened intently. The house was completely silent. "Hello?" I called out, feeling slightly ridiculous. Of course, there was no response. I decided to investigate. Grabbing my phone's flashlight, I slowly climbed the stairs, testing each step to see if my weight could have caused the knocking sound. None of the steps produced anything close to what I'd heard. The upstairs hallway was dark except for the beam from my flashlight. I checked each room methodically, the master bedroom, the bathroom, and the 2 smaller bedrooms I was using for storage. Nothing seemed out of place. No windows were open, no tree branches were tapping against the house, and there were no signs of animals that might have gotten in. Feeling a mixture of relief and confusion, I returned downstairs, convinced that I must have imagined it or misidentified some normal house sound. I finished my movie and went to bed, pushing the incident from my mind. The next day passed without incident. I worked, made dinner, and called a friend to chat about weekend plans. By the time I went to bed, I had almost forgotten about the knocking from the previous night. Until 3:17 a.m., when I was jolted awake by 3 loud knocks directly above my bedroom. My heart raced as I sat up in bed. The sound was unmistakable this time. 3 deliberate knocks in the same rhythm as before, but louder, more insistent. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning my bedroom as if expecting to see someone standing there. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself. "There's a logical explanation." I got out of bed and turned on all the lights in my bedroom. The sudden brightness was reassuring, pushing back the shadows that seemed to loom larger than usual. I stood perfectly still, listening for any other sounds. 3 minutes passed in complete silence. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, the knocking came again. 3 perfect knocks from upstairs, directly above me. A chill ran down my spine. My bedroom was on the first floor, and directly above it was the master bedroom, which I had thoroughly checked the night before and found empty. I had 2 choices: ignore it and try to go back to sleep, or investigate again. The rational part of my brain insisted I check it out, find the source, and put my mind at ease. But another part, a primal, instinctive part, warned me against going upstairs alone in the middle of the night. In the end, rationality won. I grabbed a baseball bat from my closet, a precaution that felt silly but necessary, and slowly made my way to the staircase. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound amplified in the silent house. The upstairs hallway was darker than I remembered, the shadows deeper and more ominous. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out. I was left with only my phone's flashlight to guide me. I checked each room again, more thoroughly this time. The master bedroom was empty, its closet and ensuite bathroom equally devoid of anything unusual. The other rooms were still filled with unpacked boxes and furniture, exactly as I had left them. As I was about to head back downstairs, a thought occurred to me. I hadn't checked the attic. There was a small hatch in the ceiling of the hallway, accessible via a pull-down ladder. I hadn't been up there yet. The real estate agent had mentioned it was just used for storage and was currently empty. I stood beneath the hatch, shining my flashlight up at it. The thought of climbing up there in the middle of the night seemed absurd, but I needed to be thorough if I wanted to sleep peacefully. I reached up and pulled the cord, unfolding the ladder. It came down smoothly, without the creaking I expected from an older house. I took a deep breath and began to climb, the baseball bat tucked under my arm. The attic was surprisingly clean. No cobwebs or dust bunnies, just empty space with exposed beams and insulation. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. I was about to climb back down when I noticed something in the far corner. A small wooden box. Curiosity got the better of me. I carefully made my way across the attic, stepping only on the beams to avoid putting my foot through the ceiling below. When I reached the box, I crouched down to examine it. It was an old jewelry box, intricately carved with floral patterns. It seemed out of place in the otherwise empty attic. I hesitated before opening it, suddenly aware of how quiet the house had become. Even the usual creaks and settling sounds had stopped, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Inside the box was a single item, a tarnished silver locket on a thin chain. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. There was an inscription on the back, but it was too worn to read in the dim light. As I held the locket, a sudden cold draft swept through the attic, causing me to shiver. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in seconds. My breath fogged in front of my face, and the flashlight beam flickered momentarily. Then came the knocking, 3 distinct knocks that seemed to come from directly beneath me, from the hallway floor. I nearly dropped the locket in shock. The sound was louder than before, more urgent. I quickly placed the locket back in the box and made my way to the ladder. As I descended, the house felt different, colder, more watchful. I closed the attic hatch and hurried back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, even though I lived alone. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake, listening for any sounds, but the house remained silent until morning. The next day, I called the real estate agent who had sold me the house. I tried to keep my tone casual, as I asked if the previous owners had left anything in the attic. "Not that I know of," she replied. "They were very thorough about removing all their belongings. Why do you ask?" I told her about finding the jewelry box, describing it in detail. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That's strange," she finally said. "The previous owner, Mrs. Caldwell, had a jewelry box like that, but she was very attached to it. I can't imagine she would have left it behind." "Do you know how I can contact her?" I asked. "I'd like to return it if it's hers." Another pause. "I'm afraid that's not possible. Mrs. Caldwell passed away about 6 months ago. Her children sold the house as part of settling her estate." A chill ran down my spine. "How did she die, if you don't mind me asking?" "In her sleep, I believe. She was in her 80s, so it wasn't unexpected. Her husband had passed a few years earlier." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, trying to process this information. The rational part of my brain suggested that the jewelry box had simply been overlooked during the move-out. The knocking could be explained by the house settling or pipes expanding. There was nothing supernatural about it. But another part of me wasn't convinced. That evening, I decided to learn more about the locket. I took it from the box and examined it under better light. The inscription was still difficult to read, but I could make out what appeared to be a date. June 17th, 1953. Perhaps a wedding anniversary or birthday? I tried to open the locket, but it seemed to be stuck. I didn't want to force it and risk breaking what might be a cherished keepsake, so I set it aside and did some research on the previous owners instead. An online obituary for Elizabeth Caldwell confirmed what the real estate agent had told me. She had died peacefully in her sleep at age 84, preceded in death by her husband of 56 years, Robert. They had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. The obituary mentioned that Elizabeth had been a piano teacher for most of her life, giving lessons in her home to generations of neighborhood children. I found myself staring at her photo, a kind-faced elderly woman with silver hair and bright eyes. It was hard to connect this smiling grandmother with the unsettling knocking in my house. That night, I placed the jewelry box on my bedside table, with the locket inside. I wasn't sure why I brought it downstairs, but it felt important somehow. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the previous night's lack of rest. But at exactly 3:17 a.m., I was awakened by 3 knocks. Not from upstairs this time, but from my bedside table. I sat up, heart pounding, and turned on the lamp. The jewelry box sat exactly where I had left it, seemingly undisturbed. But as I watched, the lid slowly opened on its own. I should have been terrified. I should have run from the room, from the house. But instead, I felt an odd sense of calm. There was no malevolence in the air, just a palpable sense of waiting. With trembling fingers, I reached for the locket. As soon as I touched it, it sprung open, revealing 2 tiny photographs inside. On one side was a young woman, presumably Elizabeth in her youth. On the other was a young man in a military uniform. Robert, I assumed. As I held the open locket, the room grew cold again. My bedside lamp flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner of my room, an elderly woman watching me with sad eyes. I blinked, and the figure was gone. But the cold remained, and so did the sense that I wasn't alone. "Mrs. Caldwell?" I whispered, feeling both foolish and frightened. "Is that you?" No response came, but the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. Acting on instinct, I spoke again. "I found your locket. It's beautiful. Would you like me to give it to your family?" 3 soft knocks sounded from the jewelry box. Yes. I spent the next day tracking down Elizabeth Caldwell's children. It wasn't difficult. The obituary had named them, and social media did the rest. Her eldest daughter, Margaret, still lived in the area. I sent her a message explaining that I had recently bought her mother's house and had found something that might have sentimental value. She responded within hours, and we arranged for her to visit the following day. Margaret Caldwell was in her 60s, with the same kind eyes as her mother. When I showed her the jewelry box and locket, her hand flew to her mouth. "We looked everywhere for this," she said, voice thick with emotion. "It was Mom's most treasured possession. Dad gave it to her on their first anniversary, with their pictures inside. She wore it every day until her arthritis made the clasp too difficult to manage." She opened the locket with practiced ease, smiling at the photographs inside. "These were taken right before Dad shipped out to Korea. They'd only been married a few months." "I found it in the attic," I explained. "I'm not sure how it got there." Margaret shook her head. "Mom would never have put it in the attic. She kept it on her bedside table. After she died, we couldn't find it anywhere. We assumed it had been misplaced during one of her hospital stays." I didn't mention the knocking or the cold spots or the figure I thought I'd seen. Instead, I simply said I was glad the locket had found its way back to her family. As Margaret was leaving, she paused at the door. "You know, it's strange. Today would have been Mom and Dad's anniversary, 57 years. She smiled sadly. "I like to think they're together now." That night, I slept soundly for the first time in days. The house was quiet. No knocking, no cold spots, no sense of being watched. It was just a house again, with the normal creaks and settling sounds of an older building. In the weeks that followed, I finished unpacking and truly made the house my home. Occasionally, I thought about Elizabeth Caldwell and her locket, wondering if her spirit had somehow remained attached to that cherished keepsake, unable to rest until it was returned to her family. I never experienced anything else unexplainable in the house. No more knocking, no more mysterious figures. But sometimes, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I find myself glancing up at the ceiling, half expecting to hear those 3 distinct knocks. And on June 17th, the anniversary inscribed on the locket, I placed a small bouquet of flowers on the bedside table that had once belonged to Elizabeth Caldwell, a small acknowledgement of the woman who had lived and died in this house, and who, for a brief time, had shared it with me. I don't tell many people this story. Most would think I imagined it all: the knocking, the cold spots, the figure in my bedroom. Sometimes, I almost convince myself that's true. Almost. But then I remember the look on Margaret's face when she held her mother's locket, and I know that some connections transcend the boundary between life and death. Some loves are strong enough to knock on the walls between worlds, trying to find their way home.